Hi, Mark.
Hi, Andy.
Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Can we start by my asking you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Mark Hardingham. I'm Suffolk's Chief Fire Officer and also a Director in Suffolk County Council, looking after trading standards, emergency planning and health and safety.
Cool. Do you want to tell us about where you're moving to as well, by the way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came to Suffolk in 2010. So after just coming up 11 years here, I've been successful in being appointed to be the chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council. So sadly, I'll be leaving Suffolk in a couple of months' time to take that role on early in the new year. So yeah, really been a great 10 years, but a really exciting opportunity and something I'm really looking forward to.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I've got 4 questions for you. And the first one is quite a common one that I ask everyone, and that's so about you and your teams. How have you been looking after yourself during the pandemic, and how have you been supporting your teams?
Yeah, okay. I'll do the teams bit first, and then I'll come back onto myself. So I think if I reflect back to the early days of the virus and lockdown, I think what the fire service in particular, but also the other parts I look after, really wanted was a sense of stability and direction, and some sort of confidence and assurance in the leadership of the organisation. So we did what a lot of other people did, really, Andy, which was put systems in place, put a clear structure in place. We had plans around how we were initially going to deal with the consequences of the virus, and at the same time carry on delivering the business as usual work that we were doing across a range of services, but particularly in the fire and rescue service, and that sort of 999 operational response that everybody would have expected us, quite rightly, to be able to maintain. I think that what we also saw at the outset, as like a lot of organisations, we started to scale back the work we were doing to enable us to continue to deliver that service, but comply with the lockdown approach that was coming from national government. We had an awful lot of people within the fire service, within trading standards and elsewhere, who were looking to get involved in volunteering to try and support colleagues, vulnerable people in Suffolk, parts of the county council, which were seeing significant increase in demand, and also out into the voluntary sector as well. So I think it was incumbent upon us to support people to enable them to do that because they wanted to do it, and I think got some solace in being able to do it as well. So we had a lot of people who were involved in being seconded into the ambulance service because of the sort of demand they were getting, working with the coroner's office, and just doing other roles across the county council and elsewhere that they wouldn't normally do. And actually, ironically, one of the challenges was we didn't have a role for everybody who wanted to volunteer. So how do you deal with managing the expectations of those who want to volunteer, but actually there isn't really the facility or for the role for them to step into? I think the other, we've been doing this for a few years now, sort of part of the culture of the service as well. And I think you have to, we wanted to support people by having an environment where we trust managers to get on and do their job and support people in the organisation based upon some sort of generic guidance that we provide them. And as senior leaders, sometimes your role at times of crisis is to resist that temptation to reach down into the organisation and try and solve things. And I think part of the way you support people is you give them the freedom and the flexibility to use their common sense, use their judgment, use their experience to make decisions and run the organisation how they know that it needs to be run. And my final bit, I suppose, in terms of the organisation, Andy, is about particularly as we lost that direct physical face-to-face activity, you had to find other ways to support your colleagues in a more digital way. So again, like many organisations, it was about webinars, it was about use of surveys, it was about regular messages into the organisation, it was about picking people out and dropping a letter here, an email there, a text message here, and just maintaining that sort of personal contact in a slightly different way. And then the fire services and trading stands and elsewhere are made up of lots of little teams. And part of it for me was about recognising that I have a team, a small team within those organisations. So my direct responsibility is to look after my senior team and to make sure that they're well catered for, well looked after and being supported, and then trust them to do the same, and you have that ripple effect down into the organisation. In terms of me personally, what did I do? Well, eventually I started to eat healthy food, but I've got to say for the first 3 or 4 months that wasn't really the case, and I think my reflection when I look back now is that there was so much going on at the time. I think some of that personal looking after yourself sort of fell onto the back burner slightly. So when I reflect now and some of the things I'm doing now, is it gets back to basics for me. I think you have to eat relatively healthy food, ignoring the chocolate pudding and custard that I had for lunch today, Andy. But I think you have to eat relatively healthy. I'm not a fitness freak or anything like that, but I do like to exercise, both for the sort of physical aspects, but also the mental health aspects, and it gets you away from the computer and gets you out into the fresh air. So some fitness stuff as well. I've increasingly looked to build in slots in the day where I find time for a bit of downtime. So my wife and I are both fairly early risers, and we're both busy with work and things like that. So for quite a while now, we've had a 7:15 cup of tea and cup of coffee in the morning for 3/4 an hour, where we just sit on the sofa and chat about the day as you do. And I've also changed the way I work at home. So I'm quite lucky really in that I've got a place outside in the garden that I can go into. So whereas for the first 4 or 5 months I was in the house with everybody else, I'm now out in the garden, and that's helped me with creating that separation between home and work, which I recognise was increasingly important as we got 3, 4, 5 months or so into it. Although I'd equally accept, Andy, there is still work to be done on that, and I've not quite nailed that one yet, like a lot of other people. The one thing I just finished on with this question is sleep, because I expected at the start of this that with working from home, one of the things that I would get into the habit of doing much better is sleeping in the morning and sleeping for longer, because I've always been a bit of an early riser to get in before the traffic. But actually, despite listening to podcasts and reading the odd thing or two about sleeping tips and stuff like that, I have no problem getting to sleep, but I do tend to wake up really early in the morning. And if there was something I could change, it would be that extra hour and a half in bed in the morning, just to feel like I'd had a really good night's sleep. So something to work on there, I think, over the next couple of months, Andy.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, sleep comes up a lot in conversation about the pandemic and the way that we're working now. It's good to hear you having your coffees in the morning and starting the day in that way. It's great to hear about the way that you've adapted to support your teams. And it's important to note that you do also look after trading standards that have had a very important role to play here during this last 7 months, particularly around fraud and scams and so on.
Absolutely.
And naturally, I'm not surprised to hear about the volunteering aspect, because Suffolk Fire Service, in fact, the fire service generally is well renowned for its membership being out there for the community and getting really stuck in. So really good answer to the first one. Thank you.
Okay.
Second one, you asked for this question, and this is an unusual question, which I really liked. What's life been like being a parent through this pandemic, but a parent of, I think, 2 adult kids?
Yeah, it's I've got 2 boys who are Jack and Joey. Joey's 20, Jack's 23, and they both still live at home. So I think so. My reflection is on that parenting of older children, and I guess everybody's answer to this question depends upon where you are in your parenting cycle, really, and your circumstances around your own children. And there are many times when Vicky, my wife, and I have sort of sat there and reflected on how difficult it must be to have really young children at this point in time. I guess in one respect, you could say they don't know any different and become very accustomed to change quite quickly when they're very young. But equally, that balance of trying to occupy young children, trying to do the homeschooling, and also some of the concerns people have got about the future, and trying to explain that to really young children must be really, really difficult. So I'm glad mine are a little bit older, and they're both working as well, which is great at the moment. And we're perhaps touch on the economy stuff a little bit later on in some of the other questions, but they're both working at the moment and both working at home. So it's been interesting, having gone from two boys who I hardly ever saw anything of because they were either at work or they were down the pub or playing sports with their mates, to four of us now working all together in the same house, in each other's company 24/7 to an extent. So we get on, I would say, most of the time. I don't get too carried away around that, but we get on most of the time. But what I would say is we found ourselves talking a lot about trying to reflect back on what it was like when we were their age. And when I was their age, my life revolved around sport, friends, and social life. And any money I earned at that age went towards one of those three things. So to lose that at their age, and kids grow up so quickly, and young adults grow up so quickly, to lose that at their age, we've tried to sort of put ourselves in their shoes, particularly in the first sort of 4 or 5 months when we were right in the midst of the lockdown. I mean, there's a bit more freedom and flexibility, certainly in this part of the country, for them at the moment. So we've tried, and particularly during that period, we consciously tried to be more tolerant and a little bit more relaxed, but at the same time recognising that they still need boundaries and we still need boundaries to make sure that you kind of do what's appropriate. And I would say as well, I have good days, I have bad days. My wife has good days and bad days, and sometimes you have to recognise that your kids have good days and bad days as well. And I think that's all part of that, recognising when's the time to have certain conversations with your kids and when's the time to back off and leave it till later on in the week or whatever that might be. So it's been really interesting, and there's bits that have gone really well and there's bits that have been more difficult. But what I would say on balance is I've really enjoyed their company. So it's actually been one of the things out of C19 that it would be a sense of a slight reluctance to go back to how it was sort of back end of last year when I hardly ever saw them really. There's a bit of me would be pleased because they'd be out and having a great time, but I'd miss them. So yeah, I think it's for me, it's a really fascinating area.
That's a lovely insight and very personal one. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Mark.
Okay.
It's got very dark all of a sudden because I think it's raining outside, so I'm going to have to lean over a little bit and make sure I get the next question right. The lockdown started about 7 months ago. What's the difference for you between how it felt then and how it feels now? So,
I mean, it's 7 months. You wonder where that 7 months has gone, Andy, don't you? It's frightening, really, how quickly it's gone by. I think I've got accustomed to it, and I think we collectively have got more accustomed to it. But at the same time as we're getting accustomed to it, we're getting weary. And I've just literally sent out an article and a message across all of my teams and stuck it on Twitter this afternoon. An article that was shared with me about that 6 month of the impact, and it's a fascinating article. And I do think we're starting to see more of that because that timing of 6 months is relevant, but also we're now at the back end of the summer, so that 6 months has landed almost the sort of worst time of the year really, as people look with a bit of apprehension towards the nights closing in and the weather getting worse. But at the same time, I think I feel much more informed and confident now, and less panicky, I would say, because it was so different and so almost like a film set when it first happened, that I do feel more confident and more comfortable is not the right word really, but informed, I suppose, Andy, than I did before. And whilst you still read plenty of doom and gloom articles in the paper and elsewhere, if you look carefully, you do pick out the optimistic ones as well. And I do think that we're much more, in terms of the virus itself, feels to me like we understand the signs and symptoms more. We understand much more now about how it's transmitted. I think the medical profession are much clearer, much better informed, and much better prepared in terms of how you're going to respond and support people who've got the virus with the sort of treatments that are available to everybody. So I feel probably more confident about that. And we touched a little bit earlier around the economy stuff. So probably slightly less confident on the economic front and just what this is going to mean for the long-term economy. And I touched on my children earlier, so I'm less worried from a personal perspective, much more worried from a young person's perspective. So with two kids who are at the moment in work, but my older one's likely to be out of work from January, and I'm starting to think now about, well, actually, what on earth is he going to do? He works in London in a bank at the moment, but his contract comes to an end. It's his first ever job. What on earth do you do, and what do you find in the economic environment we're likely to be facing in the new year? So slightly more concerned, I suppose, about that at the moment. I think the guidance that's available, I would like to think that there's much more now of an application of common sense around the guidance that's coming out, because we've all talked about there's guidance from everywhere and it's slightly different in slightly different contexts, but as we collectively have become more accustomed to it, I think the majority of people are applying a good deal of common sense about how that guidance is applied in a way that enables us to get on with our lives as best we possibly can. And the final thing I would say, reflecting on how I felt 7 months ago to how I feel now, is I no longer wake up in the morning thinking it's a dream, which I kind of slightly did for about the first month. I did used to wake myself up from time to time, and it would take 30 seconds or so before you realise, no, blimey, this is the world that we currently live in now, and I'm sure I wasn't alone in thinking that.
Yeah, no, it's none of us have, well, maybe a few of us have kept the diary, and you're quite right. If you'd read the diaries of the lockdown itself, the initial lockdown, it would be very different to now. It was the uncertainty, wasn't it? And it's not knowing what was coming the next hour, the next day, the next week. But you're right. We have more of an idea of what's coming, and we're trying to become more prepared for it, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's right, Andy.
And I think in terms of employment, the fire service will be even more inundated with applications in the future than it has been in the past.
Yeah, well, I think we had 653 apply for the 20 odd places that we advertised about 12 months ago. So I think you're right. I do think the public sector and sort of anchor institutions like the emergency services are going to become increasingly attractive places for people to come to work.
Yeah, that's true. There's an advantage there, definitely. That the last question, which is looking to the future. I know your future lies elsewhere, but what would you tell others, and maybe your incumbent new chief officer that'll be coming in, that we should have learned from and be more aware of the challenges about the outbreak?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things I would feed in really. One would be that we need to resist the tendency to go back to how things used to be. So there is a new normal, as the sort of term that's been bandied around, that is going to come as a consequence of this, hopefully in the early part of next year. But to some extent, it's already emerging, really. So I would want whoever takes over the fire and rescue service and the county council role from me to recognise a number of things, really. There's a bit about the role of the fire and rescue service. So we have delivered our core service in the way that people would expect and the way that we would normally do, but equally we've branched out and done different things as well. And I think in the future there is an opportunity for the fire and rescue service to be even more involved and even more embedded in supporting vulnerable people and those that really need help across Suffolk, working closely with other parts of the public sector. I think the second thing I would say would be around leadership style. So again, it didn't happen because of the virus, it was happening anyway, but I think it's embedded a different style of leadership in the organisation, about pushing decisions down into the organisation, and having the trust and confidence for people in the organisation based on a really good understanding of what it is that your organisation is there to achieve and the sort of behaviours and values of your organisation. And if people understand those two things, we'll then trust them to make good quality decisions because they're closest to the impact of that decision. Sometimes as a chief fire officer, you are the worst person in the room to make a decision because you're so distant from the impact of that decision. So there's definitely something about recognising that. And then the third thing from an organisational perspective will be, we've talked for a long time in the fire service, no different to any other organisation, about embracing new ways of working, about embracing technology, about embracing digital and working in a different way. And for a long time, it's been organisations inching towards that because it's quite difficult to let go of the way that we've always grown up in organisations and learned how to operate. And then all of a sudden something happens which is a catalyst to make you do something in a very different way. And I think this virus has shown that when we need to, we can operate in a very, very different way. And how do we now then embed some of that into the fire service, other parts of local authority or many different organisations, so that becomes the new normal, the new way of working in the future, in balance, of course, because there are some things that we have lost which we would want to go back to, and some of that physical face-to-face contact and engagement with people in your organisation is something that has been lost to an extent. So I wouldn't want to throw all of the old stuff out, but there are certainly some really good new stuff in there that I would want to grab hold of as well.
Brilliant. 3 fundamental lessons, but I'm particularly interested in the leadership one. For a whole culture like that to shift over the last 7 months is quite astonishing. But so what is that, you presenting that to the organisation, or is that your team?
To be honest, it's a journey that we started about 4 years ago, Andy.
All right.
And it's led by me, and I've said for a long time when I talk to colleagues, particularly I'll talk about it in the fire service context, when I talk to colleagues in the fire service, my role is about the leadership and culture of the organisation. I've got lots of other really good managers who deal with the sort of day-to-day running of the fire and rescue service. I'm really clear that leadership, culture, equality and inclusion in the service is the responsibility that lies primarily with me. So we've been doing lots of work using a whole range of different sort of organisations who've come in and supported us and help us, but actually from reading you do, from what you see in other organisations and bringing things in. So we've done a lot of work about building a different culture around a much clearer, a much stronger approach around equality and inclusion. We've changed our recruitment processes, our appointment and promotion processes. We've brought in new values and behaviours, and we've done a significant amount of direct face-to-face engagement with staff to kind of walk through that, talk through that, and then in addition to that, adjust all the systems and processes within the organisation so they reflect your new way of working rather than the old way of working, because it's all very well talking about a different leadership and culture, but if your systems and processes don't belie that change, then people just won't buy into it and believe it. So it's been going on for a long time now, Andy, and we'll carry on hopefully long after I've gone as well, because I'm not sure it's a journey that ever stops. But I think we've seen some of the benefits of that early work in terms of how the organisation has responded over the last 6 or 7 months. I think it's a object.
Yeah, no, that's a great legacy to leave behind. Mark, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Great to see you.